All right, class. Today we want to continue the naturalist materialist piece of the pie, where the mechanism for the diversity of life in the world as we know it is seen under evolution. Now, I don't want you to confuse evolution with origins per se, but in one sense, you could talk about origins being more like a biogenesis issue, where we could talk about the Big Bang or how life itself emerged. Darwin's theory of evolution wasn't answering those sorts of origin questions, like where the universe came from, where matter came from, how life originated. What he was focused on was more looking at the similarity of life on the planet. He was curious about how this could have come about. And I think this would be a good place for us to start today. You know, our last class, we talked about science and the scientific method and kind of the tension between a theistic with a revelatory type of truth or an authoritarian type of truth, and science, which is using empirical type truth that you can study, observe, test. And part of what Dr. Eugenie Scott was pointing out was the superiority of sciences. You don't have to have an experience with the Holy Spirit or Krishna consciousness or take some hallucinogenic drug like the Yanomamo Indians. But whether you're a Buddhist, a Christian, a Hindu, an atheist, you can look at the same physical data, the empirical evidence, and you can do tests together and come to conclusions that aren't based from some outside esoteric revelatory source or personal experience. This science is about the shared experience and what we can know together. So I think a nice place to start today would be, I want to show you what put Charles Darwin on this path of trying to find another explanation for humans on the planet or life on the planet besides the biblical Genesis account. Now, as a young man, he actually was a seminarian and he was studying to go into the ministry, but he also loved nature. And he was like a naturalist, loved to study and actually make his own kind of rudimentary experiments. And so I want to share with you what changed his path from the seminary to becoming a scientist, an early 19th century scientist. And this is one of the things he saw. And it's a little graphic, so bear with me. Hope it doesn't damage you.
Our parasitized caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat.
Oh dear.
The wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight. The larvae have not yet finished growing and need to keep their host alive. So although they feast on the caterpillar's blood, they have been careful not to touch a single one of its vital organs. This uneasy truce will not last. Within days, the larvae are fully matured. Suddenly, they begin to stir into action. For the past 2 weeks, this surrogate womb has protected them, but now they no longer need it. To complete the next stage of their life cycle, they must break out. The caterpillar's thick skin should be a solid barrier to the parasitic wasp larvae. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny, saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out. Stroke by stroke, the larvae slice through the tough layers of skin. At the same time, they release chemicals that paralyze the caterpillar. As the larvae break through, there is nothing it can do. Free at last, the larvae enter a new phase of development. They swiftly spin silken cocoons. These will provide the perfect environment for their final transformation. But ironically, one of the greatest dangers the larvae will face is being themselves impregnated by other species of parasitic wasp.
Holy
Incredibly,
cow.
the wounded caterpillar helps them out. Usually, a caterpillar would spin a silken blanket to make its own cocoon. But the parasitized caterpillar spins his blanket on top of the wasp cocoons, giving them an extra layer of protection. Scientists believe the same wasp virus that infected it weeks before has now invaded the caterpillar's brain and caused this bizarre corruption of its normal behavior. Amazingly, the caterpillar's natural aggression is now also exploited by the wasp virus. The caterpillar becomes a bodyguard, actively protecting the cocoons from other parasites. It will watch over them unceasingly until it eventually starves to death.
All right, so holy cow. If you can imagine this poor seminary student out doing his field work, and he sees or becomes aware of these parasitic wasps that are zombieizing caterpillars and using them as a host for their larvae that eat their way out, and something even takes place in the caterpillar's brain where it goes against its own nature and its own self-preservation to where it actually ends up using its silk for its own cocoon for the larval wasp, and then protects them against their own wasp predators. And Darwin, when he saw this, he just could not reconcile something like this in nature with a loving, benevolent God. It was just too horrific. And there's a lot more examples. I mean, we can talk about tiger sharks, how in the womb, the offspring, they have live birth. The siblings actually swim around in the womb and hunt each other and eat each other. So their tiger sharks are already being born committing fratricide. And it's just a grisly thing to think about. Some insects aren't even born with mouths, or some aren't even born with an opening to the womb, so the babies have to basically eat their way out of the mother who dies upon birth. And you're just thinking, how this doesn't sound like my loving Jesus, right? Suffer the little children to come unto me. This sounds like sadistic tyrant. And it's the whole problem of evil again. How can these horrible things be happening in the world if there's a loving, all-powerful creator God? Why isn't he intervening or stopping it? Or why would he make such horrific things? So Darwin began to look for non-spiritual explanations. Now, as you remember from the early part of the class, the idea of evolution or life coming out of the sea goes all the way back to the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus. So the theory of evolution is not new. It's quite ancient. What was new about what Darwin did was he provided a mechanism, a non-theistic mechanism for how life could go from all being the same, or a single-celled organism from which all life would come. And at this point, I think it's important if you remember the illustration of the great chain of being. And once again, I'm sad not having my whiteboard, but I'll just do it with my hand. So if you remember, with Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, we have pure being, God, the Father of lights. And these are kind of like radiating out. You could look at it that way, or like a hierarchy, or like a ladder. And so on top, you would have pure being, the true God, the high God. And then below him, you would have the demiurge, the craftsman, followed by spirits. And then humans are on this really weird horizon point, because humans have both a physical material body, but they also have a soul or spirit. And so they have both this non-physical aspect, like the spirits, the demiurge, and the Father of Lights above, but they also have physicality, like the rungs of the ladder that will come below. Next would be like animals, plants, minerals, then all the way down to non-being or nothing. Now, what is so interesting is you have to remember the influence Neoplatonism had on the Western mind and consciousness, and scholasticism and Christianity. And so it was basically what Darwin did was he did a naturalistic or materialistic adaptation of the great chain of being. So if you only believe the physical material world exists, man would now become the highest thing on the rung of living things, at least that we're aware of on the planet. So if you don't believe in spirits or demiurge or God, that whole top goes, as well as that inner non-material part of human beings. So what we have are physical material humans who are at the top of like the evolutionary ladder and food chain, and it just goes down from there. And you could make hierarchies. You could make hierarchies even in humans. And in our last video that I'm going to share with you, we're going to talk about social Darwinism and how this Darwinian theory of adaptation and later added this idea of survival of the fittest. And we'll talk about what those things mean. But now we simply have humans, animals, plants, minerals. And that's kind of like this natural Western hierarchy we have, seeing the value of different things. This added some confusion, however, because remember, this is an early theory. He's trying to work out these things. And so Darwin's big ideas are common ancestry, where we all came from a single-celled organism, and then adaptation or natural selection. And natural selection takes place because in any given environment, certain creatures, or maybe even certain members of a given species, will have certain traits or features that may allow them to survive better than others. And so the environment, it's not like a conscious, willful, divine selection. It's simply, if you're living in a cold climate and say you have a family of rodents and some of them have a lot of fur and some are almost naked, well, the furrier rodents are going to survive in that environment because of the temperature. And the ones with less fur are not going to grow up and have babies. So they're not going to pass on the genetic drift on the hairless end of the rodent family. But the hairier rodents are the ones that are going to survive the cold, grow up old enough to make their own babies, and they're going to pass on those traits. And so this is how we get genetic drift. And Darwin was very aware of this. He raised pigeons along with many other 19th century Victorian gentlemen, and they would do breeding tests. And I don't know if you've ever seen, you Google it sometime, the variety of pigeons. It's unbelievable. And so Darwin, looking at what Europeans had been able to do with plants and animals through hybridization, where you select plants or animals for different traits and you breed them together with other plants or animals that have those same traits. So that's how you can get a range of like horses, everything from a toy horse or miniature horse the size of a medium-sized dog all the way up to a Clydesdale. They're all still horses, but you have that huge range of genetic drift within the equine family. Now, Darwin simply then speculated, if we could bring about this kind of radical change within a couple thousand years of human domestication of animals, imagine what nature, the diversity nature could bring about if given tens of thousands of years. Still, the age of the earth was relatively considered young at the time by most Western Europeans. But as the theory of evolution took root and gained more support, we also see the estimates of the age of the earth and universe expanding as well. And I'll explain some of that in a minute. Okay. All right. Any comments or questions before I show you the next clip? Nobody? All right. Just one sec, and I got to pull up my next video.
This is Tyler.
Now, basically what they're going to show you in this video, and I appreciate, they're starting to get away from this idea of a ladder going from simple to complex. And this is more like the tree of life, where there's still a belief in a common ancestor, but you see it's kind of zoomed in, almost like fractals, where you have this little creature traveling and you see all these different branches going off that are different parts of the family tree. And so this is a little more nuanced form than just the great chain of being. And so this video is basically following this single-celled life form as it goes through all these different mutations. And it's going to show it leads eventually to the human family tree. The Homo. Oh, getting close. Okay. Any comments or questions about that? I thought that was a helpful illustration, and I really appreciated how they weren't just showing a ladder from a single cell up to humans, like in a modified great chain of being, but it was more nuanced. They showed how the single cell, as it adapts and modifies, mutates, it begins to branch off, and this is where we would get, the big branches would be like the plant and animal kingdom, the difference between like fish and birds, or reptiles and avians and mammals. So with insects, so we have all these branches going off, and the branches, as they keep spreading out, get more and more speciated, right? Until we even get into subspeciation. And so Darwin's idea is over time, life continues to change and merge and grow, but it also splits off into unique, usually environmental pressures, right? Where life finds a niche. And that's why you have some creatures that have remained virtually unchanged for perhaps hundreds of millions of years, according to a Darwinian timeline, or a contemporary geological timeline. And you can see some of the conflict, especially if you're a young Earth creationist, right? This is a very different account than God speaking and creating life, right? Or calling the seas to bring forth life, or the earth to bring forth life. Here we have life happening by chance. It's not a design, it's not in a purpose. And through mutation and adaptation, we get all of the varieties we get today. All right. I do want you to talk to me about this question, though. And in that pamphlet I was telling you about, 13 Answers to Creationist Nonsense, one of the things, this guy's pet peeve that drove him crazy, was Christians that would say stuff like, well, I didn't come from no monkey, and if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around? Could someone please answer that in a way that will not make me cringe? Why do we still have monkeys around if humans came from monkeys? And this is one of the creationist questions that just drives this poor evolutionist crazy. Basically, his retort to it is, how about you read a science book on evolution, and then we can have a conversation. All right, Samuel's typing. Feel free to use your mic, Samuel, if you want to talk to me, but I'll read your text too. Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Sam. Samuel is educated. And this is what I want you all to be. I want you all to be able to answer this question, or not ask ignorant questions like that. It just shows you don't understand where modern evolutionary theory is if you make statements. So Samuel says modern monkeys and modern humans came from an ancient common ancestor. It's not like monkeys turned into chimpanzees, and chimpanzees turned into Afarensis, and Afarensis turned into Homo erectus, and Homo erectus into Neanderthals, into Cro-Magnon, into Homo sapiens sapiens, right? It's somewhere in that family tree, there's a split between like proto-humans and proto-modern gorillas or the great apes. And so in those branches, they converge. And in the fossil record, we would expect to also find extinct ancient versions of apes, as well as ancient versions of humans. And that is exactly what evolutionary paleontologists believe they are finding. And so I want to show you a couple examples now of like the human family tree and how they see the explanation for this. Any questions before I show you the next clip? This one's from National Geographic, so it's real quick. And
millions of years before industry
sorry, still learning. I got to share my screen. There we go.
agriculture, and civilization, the world stage was set for one creature's unprecedented rise. The story of humanity's evolution began about 7 million years ago, when the human lineage broke away from that of chimpanzees. Over time, an ensemble cast of over 20 early human species, or hominins, came to the fore. Most became extinct, while others might have been ancestors to today's humans. Each species exhibited varying degrees of human-like physical and behavioral traits, such as exhibited varying degrees of today's humans. Became extinct, while others...
Sorry, I wanted to pause the screen for a second because this is really important. If you can see, we have all these different proto-humans from Homo erectus, Homo Afarensis, Africanus, etc., Neanderthals, Homo sapiens. And as you can see on the timeline, we have like 5, 6 different species overlapping. And that's exactly what we tend to see in the fossil record. We don't see like one species going and then disappearing, and then in the next strata and layers, we see the next. But you have 5, 6 different species of proto-humans, or what's considered modern human, living in the same time period. And so in this fossil record, you might find a Homo erectus in the same strata that you find a Neanderthal or a Homo sapiens. And so this is part of why some of the theory had to be adjusted and revised from this latter approach to this branch approach, where you could have a lot of co-contemporaneous species or subspecies of humans, and where only one species of humans remains today, at least that I'm aware of. All right, I just wanted to point that out.
might have been ancestors to today's humans. Each species exhibited varying degrees of human-like physical and behavioral traits, such as large brains, small teeth, bipedality, and tool use. These hominins fell into three major groups: early hominins, Australopithecines, and Homo genus. Humanity's earliest relatives lived between 7 and 4.4 million years ago in Africa. Having most recently shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees, they had many ape-like traits, such as a small cranial capacity. However, fossils show that some ancient hominins were also beginning to show human-like characteristics, such as small canines that were likely used more for eating and not for hunting or fighting. The next phase of hominin evolution involved primates called Australopithecines. They lived between 4.4 and 1.4 million years ago across the African continent. Like their ancient brethren, Australopithecines had some ape-like traits. However, changes in the skull, spine, and legs indicate a notable shift toward a very human-like trait, consistent bipedal locomotion. The third and current phase of human evolution involves members of the genus Homo.
Let me just do a little commentary here. Part of what's interesting about that picture they showed of how the spine attaches to an ape or chimpanzee as opposed to a human, for the apes, the spine is attached in the back of the skull, where humans, it's at the bottom of the skull. And so that's one of the morphology traits they're looking at to see if something's more associated with a primate or with a hominid. And I think that's really interesting. Another you'll see is like the hand morphology, how the hand bones change over time. They talked about the tooth morphology. I mean, how big are your canines? That would be one of those earlier traits they would expect to find from being more carnivorous before we move more omnivorous, or however that's working. Another was the teeth. And I found this super fascinating in my human anthropology class that I took in college. My professor had all these different skulls from different, what were considered like protohumans, like Afarensis and Australopithecines, Neanderthals, etc. And he would bring these and put them on the table. And what you could see is, and he also had like chimp and gorilla skulls and jaws. And of course, you had the larger canines in the apes, in the great apes, but they also had more of a V-shaped jaw, where in humans we have more of a U-shaped jaw. And so you actually can see the morphology in cranium capacity and the change in canines and the change of the shape of the jaw from a more V to a U. Now, what we don't know is if there is like an adaptation or evolutionary change, or if these were simply species that maintained their morphology throughout their existence before they went extinct. And the same thing with dates. I mean, we have dates in these videos, but remember, none of these fossils come with dates attached. And I'll have to do a whole nother talk on dating techniques, but basically how they're dating these fossils, at least the ones, and real quick thing on fossils. Fossils can mean a lot of different things. It can be an imprint of like a footprint or a leaf or something in mud that later turns to stone and we have that preserved. Or it could actually be organic material that has been encased in stone. That would also be considered a fossil. It's still organic material inside, but it's been encased or preserved in stone. For example, there are some fossil beds in the Grand Canyon where there are these nautiloids, which had these like large corkscrew type shells and then like a squid type creature with tentacles that lived inside of it. There's still these shells. The fleshy part has rotten and gone away, but the shells are still embedded in sandstone in the Grand Canyon, but they're still shells. Okay. And you could say, well, the shell's not organic anyways. It's calcium carbonate or whatever, but it's, in that sense, it's still a mineral. Another example would be where the organic material is replaced by minerals, like we see in petrified wood, right? You might still be able to see the rings, etc., but all the organic parts have been replaced by minerals, and sometimes it turns into beautiful things like opals, and you see these beautiful cut sections of petrified wood. And then there's other fossils, like recently there's been some finds of like some T-Rex thigh bones. They also found a Triceratops horn that had not been completely turned to stone, but there was still keratin and stuff on the inside, and they were actually able to do some dating techniques on that. So if you're dating stone, this was a long way to get to the point. If you're dating stone, you have to use different techniques than if you're dating organic matter. All right. So you can use carbon-14 dating on organic better, but you can't use it on stone. So if you're getting a carbon-14 dating of like a Neanderthal or something like that, it means they found organic material, some sort of cellular material, and they've been able to actually do a genome sequence of Neanderthals and show how similar or the differences are with human, considered modern human DNA. And all right, any questions on that? All right, I'll keep going then.
The earliest Homo species likely date to more than 2 million years ago, making them a contemporary of some Australopithecines. But unlike earlier hominins, who exhibited a mosaic of ape and human-like traits, Homo species were becoming distinctly more human. Their cranial capacity was growing larger than any other hominins. They developed sophisticated stone tool technology, and they became the first to control fire. These physical and behavioral adaptations, along with advancements in technology, allowed some Homo species to be the first to migrate out of Africa and explore the rest of the world. While a cast of over 20 hominin species have walked this earth, only one remains. Homo sapiens, shaped by millions of years of evolution, embarked on a journey of exploration and industry its ancestors could have only dreamed.
Okay. Any comments or questions on that one?
I kind of have a comment. Wasn't like a long time ago the whole like Earth was supposed to be combined in like Pangea? I think that's what it's called. So their little picture was, I don't know, a little bit confusing, I guess.
Yes.
That's it.
Okay. Is everyone understanding the basic principle here? I mean, I don't know your high school backgrounds and what you learned and all that. I just want to make sure you don't graduate or go through an origins class and don't understand. I want to make sure you understand what the contemporary leading scientific theories are on origins. Now, whether you agree with them or not is one thing, but at least for you to be educated, I want to make sure you at least know accurately what's being portrayed. I don't want you, if you would disagree with this theory, to be attacking straw men. I want you to be looking at where the evolutionary theory has gone. And just like the concept of evolution itself, it's not static, right? As more data, and this is how science is supposed to work. As more data and information comes in, I mean, think of what we understand about human beings now, and even the human cell, compared to what was understood at Darwin's time. So a lot of evolutionary theory and testing has gone into genetics, and even maybe perhaps more away from paleontology. And that's kind of a different talk, so I'll save that one. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so let me see if I can pull up a couple images for you. Whoops. On the screen share again. And you guys can do your own searches on Google and all that. But, oops, it's not the one I wanted. Sorry, still learning this screen share stuff. So in this below picture, you can see this is part of what causes some of the confusion of that we came from chimpanzees or apes when you see pictures like this. And you see them in science textbooks and all that. But I like this one because it kind of shows you the family tree and the time span in which these different species lived. And these are not just made up. I want to be very clear about that. These aren't just evil evolutionists in their laboratories trying to come up with ways to drag God out of heaven to prove that he's an Iron Age myth. No, these are actual skulls, teeth, bones that have been found throughout the world, especially in the Rift Valley in Africa. But Homo erectus, can be found all over Asia, I believe even into Australia. And so there's a huge spread and range of these different creatures. And the debate is, what were they? Were they proto-humans? Creationists, young Earth creationists would simply say they were either extinct apes or they were creatures that were within the range of human variation. And when you think of human variation today, we have everything from pygmies to people over 7 feet tall. It's amazing. And when you think about the morphology, the body types, skin tone, eye color, hair texture, all these different aspects, there's a huge diversity. And so maybe we should define what a species is. And this creates some confusion and problems. So generally, when we talk about a species, it means part of how we tell if two creatures are part of the same species is if they can interbreed together and produce viable, fertile offspring. Now, some species are close enough together that they can breed and produce offspring, but because they're different species, the offsprings will have either some sort of deformity or be born infertile. Probably the most familiar example you'd be aware of would be mules. Mules come from horse mothers and donkey fathers. But all mules are sterile. They're infertile. You don't breed two mules together to get new mules. You have to get a mare, a female horse, and a male donkey. And that's how you get a mule. Fascinating. But other species like lions and tigers, they've been able to breed them together, and we get tigrons and ligers, depending on which is the mother and father. I'm not sure. If someone wants to Google that for me, I'd be curious if those are also sterile or if they are fertile. I'm not sure. But that would be an example. So generally we describe creatures as being part of the same species if they can breed and produce viable or fertile offspring. Just recently in the news, they talked about a new species of finch was discovered in the Galapagos Islands. New species. Now, this is how it gets confusing for me. Part of what led Darwin to his belief in adaptation through mutation, this process of natural selection, was as he traveled with the beagle on this naturalistic tour of the world, and they came to the Galapagos Islands. What Darwin noticed was on each island, they all had finches, but the finches had adapted to the environment of each particular island. And I may pull this up later, but I want to kind of stick with humans for today. But this idea was, even the beak morphology, you would have some of these finches that had really strong beaks that could be used to crush hard husk seeds or maybe small sea creatures, crustaceans. So a really strong, like nutcracker type beak. But then others of these finches had beaks almost like hummingbirds. They were long and slender, and their tongue could go out and get the nectar deep into flowers. And so they were all coming from some finch common ancestor, but now they had speciated out because of the different environments. Some were eating seeds, some were eating hard nuts, others were eating fruit, others were drinking nectar, and all of that affected the morphology. Well, what had happened was one of these finches, and this is recent, had flown from one of the Galapagos Islands to another and interbred with a different species of finch there. Do you see the problem already? Yes. And so these two subspecies of finches interbred, and they produced a whole new species of finch. And what I would say is, but these aren't different species. And the reason I would say they're not different species is because they were able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, which by definition would tell me it's a species. And so it's problematic when we talk about species, because Darwinian theory is predicated on this idea that through mutation and natural selection, one species can actually morph into another species. And this is where we would have a huge divergence between young Earth creationism and Darwinian evolution. So in Darwinian evolution, where you would have a common ancestor at the base, and then that tree of life grows out of that into all these different branches, okay? Young Earth creationism, or the Genesis account, talks about kinds. It's not using the word species, but it talks about fish and birds and creeping things and beasts of the field and cattle. Okay, so it's not like the modern scientific or method or categorizations of the world, but it's broken up into these different kinds. And then from those kinds, you could get variation, right? So you could have a canine type of kind, which would be a beast of the field. But from canines, you could get everything from dingoes, coyotes, wolves, the domesticated dog. All of those would be within that canine family. Same thing with feline. You could get everything from a house cat to a saber-toothed cat, would all be within that kind. And so in a Genesis account, what you would see is more like a forest of bushes of different kinds, starting at the beginning and then branching out from those blades, where in Darwinian evolution, you start with a single cell and all life is interconnected in that branch. So young Earth creationism is more like bushes of kinds where adaptation can come out of those, but they're not, one kind isn't changing or adapting into another kind. It's going to stay kind of in its lane, even though that lane could have infinite variations. But there's brackets to those variations where it can't move out of it. All right. Questions, comments? I'm going to show you now a young Earth creationist critique. I just want you to see kind of what it looks like.
We're talking about seeing evolution today, seeing one species changing into another species. That's not going to happen.
Sorry. All right, let me bring this up. There we go.
we're talking about seeing evolution today, seeing one species changing into another species, that's not going to happen. Although there must be, from an evolutionary perspective, many transitional forms out there, the likelihood of finding any one of them is extremely low.
The more we learn about paleontology, that is fossils, the more certain we are that evolution is based on faith alone.
The National Academy of Science is the official advisor to the U.S. government on questions of science.
Oh, sorry.
In its publications, it falsely claims that the missing links that troubled Darwin are no longer missing. This is misrepresentation which deceives millions, because after 120 years of exhaustive searching, Darwin's missing links are still missing. Yet this academy and evolutionists continue to perpetuate the mythical theory that man developed from ape-like creatures.
Richard Leakey, who is one of the most well-known anthropologists, said that if he were asked to draw a family tree for man, he would just have to draw a huge question mark, because the evidence is too scanty to possibly know man's evolutionary origin, and he didn't think we're ever going to find it.
To aid and abet evolutionary concepts, artistic depictions have gone beyond ethical boundaries. Despite having no foundation for the ape-to-man theory, scientists and artists continue to dupe the public with lifelike but imaginary illustrations. These artists vainly entertain natural progressions of apes to humans and presume their hair color, skin tones, and even facial expressions from no more than a tooth, a piece of bone, or even no evidence at all. National Geographic magazine, which doesn't attempt to hide its evolutionary bias, admits that these fossilized footprints are identical to human footprints. Yet artists take the liberty to accommodate evolutionary theory and illustrate ape-like features to fit ape-like creatures. All because biased dating processes insist that these footprints were found in rock layers said to exist before humans.
Now, today we have evolutionists who would like us to believe there is solid evidence for evolution. Before the public, they generally create the impression that the evidence is just like solid gold, that man has evolved from some ape-like creature.
Dr. Donald Johansson, director of the Institute of Human Origins, discovered Lucy, an alleged ape-to-man missing link.
The human family and the ape family diverged and went on their own individual and separate evolutionary trajectories. We don't know precisely what the common ancestor was for that, but we know that it resembles something like what is called Ramapithecus.
Ramapithecus. That was formed out of nothing but a fragment of a jaw and several teeth. And for many, many years, Ramapithecus was held up as our ape-like ancestor. But now Dr. Piltdown at the Yale-Harvard Peabody Museum, when I interviewed him, he said, we have found about 40 of these creatures now, some of them fairly complete, and they are not on the direct line to becoming man at all. They're more like an orangutan.
Dr. Piltdown of Yale, who first claimed that Ramapithecus was an ancestor of man, now suggests that it isn't. Yet evolutionists continue to cite Ramapithecus as an ape-man link.
Another so-called missing link, Java Man, was concocted by Eugene Dubois when he found an ape-like skull fragment, and then 50 feet away he found a human leg bone. However, just before he died, Dubois confessed that he also found 2 human skulls at this same location, and he admitted that the skull fragment belonged to a gibbon and not to an ape man.
Homo erectus is probably best known as Java Man.
I just wanted to pause here real quick. Back when I took this class, I think it was in 1980 or something, we had Professor Lubenow. He wrote a book called Bones of Contention, and I would recommend it if you want to. And it was great. He had a huge box of skulls, everything from Afarensis all the way up to modern human. And he would arrange them on the table from like the simplest, smallest, least brain capacity up to the largest. The one notable and interesting exception there, of course, is Neanderthals had a greater brain capacity within the skull than even modern humans had. So that's a curious thing to think about. Now, of course, a bigger brain does not necessarily make you more intelligent, but that was kind of the model they were showing of this human evolution, going from a smaller brain capacity in Afarensis as it would grow through Erectus all the way up into the modern humans. Okay, anyways, Lubenow, part of our special assignment for that class, each of us were assigned a fossil of one of these proto-humans. And we had to go look at primary source material. We had to look at the write-up of who found it, when, where, and all the pertinent details. And I just so happened to, luck of the draw, I got Java Man. And it was just like what that guy said. I could not believe it. They had found a gibbon skull or orangutan skull, and they had mixed it with human remains to try to make this like composite hybrid creature. And that was right there in the literature. But for years, that kept being presented in biology textbooks or paleontology textbooks as like this was it. This was the missing link. And so I would just encourage all of you to, and I don't care which end it is, if it's creation science or Darwinian science, look at it for yourself and don't just take. And remember, textbooks and pop magazines or stuff are going to be running behind. If you really want to stay up to date, you need to be in the scientific journals, peer-reviewed journals to see where things are today, because the textbooks and what's being doled out to the public does lag behind. All right, let's finish this off.
The more certain we are that evolution is based on faith alone.
The National Academy of Science is the official advisor to the U.S. government on questions of science.
That's our Eugenie Scott friend.
It falsely claims that the missing links that troubled Darwin are no longer missing. This is misrepresentation which deceives millions, because after 120 years of exhaustive searching, Darwin's missing links are still missing. Yet this academy and evolutionists continue to perpetuate the mythical theory that man developed from ape-like creatures.
Richard Leakey, who is one of the most well-known anthropologists, said that if he were asked to draw a family tree for man, he would just have to draw a huge question mark, because the evidence is too scanty to possibly know man's evolutionary origin, and he didn't think we're ever going to find it.
To aid and abet evolutionary concepts, artistic depictions have gone beyond ethical boundaries. Despite having no foundation for the ape-to-man theory, scientists and artists continue to dupe the public with lifelike but imaginary illustrations. These artists vainly entertain natural progressions of apes to humans and presume their hair color, skin tones, and even facial expressions from no more than a tooth, a piece of bone, or even no evidence at all. National Geographic magazine, which doesn't attempt to hide its evolutionary bias, admits that these fossilized footprints are identical to human footprints. Yet artists take the liberty to accommodate evolutionary theory and illustrate ape-like features to fit ape-like creatures. All because biased dating processes insist that these footprints were found in rock layers said to exist before humans.
Now, today we have evolutionists who would like us to believe there is solid evidence for evolution. Before the public, they generally create the impression that the evidence is just like solid gold, that man has evolved from some ape-like creature.
Dr. Donald Johansson, director of the Institute of Human Origins, discovered Lucy, an alleged ape-to-man missing link.
The human family and the ape family diverged and went on their own individual and separate evolutionary trajectories. We don't know precisely what the common ancestor was for that, but we know that it resembles something like what is called Ramapithecus.
Ramapithecus. That was formed out of nothing but a fragment of a jaw and several teeth. And for many, many years, Ramapithecus was held up as our ape-like ancestor. But now Dr. Piltdown at the Yale Harvard Peabody Museum, when I interviewed him, he said, We have found about 40 of these creatures now, some of them fairly complete, and they are not on the direct line to becoming man at all. They're more like an orangutan.
Dr. Piltdown of Yale, who first claimed that Ramapithecus was an ancestor of man,
See those V-shaped jaws?
that it isn't. Yet evolutionists continue to cite Ramapithecus as an ape-man link.
Another so-called missing link, Java Man, was concocted by Eugene Dubois when he found an ape-like skull fragment, and then 50 feet away he found a human leg bone. However, just before he died, Dubois confessed that he'd also found 2 human skulls at this same location, and he admitted that the skull fragment belonged to a gibbon and not to an ape man.
Homo erectus is probably best known as Java Man. And it was at this stage in human evolution that they began to make and use these large triangular hand axes, brains expanded over 1,000 cc's, body proportions similar to ours evolved, and we were firmly on the road to later hominids, including modern humans.
This hoax is still accepted by evolutionists today, and it's presented to the public as a true missing link. If you think the Java Man hoax is incredible, wait until you hear all the facts surrounding Johansson's Lucy, this little 3.5-foot adult skeleton, which looks just like a chimpanzee.
As you know, Lucy was found in 1974, and sometimes I refer to her as the woman who shook up men's family tree, because she represents for us the oldest, most complete skeleton we have of any human ancestor known to anthropologists.
Now, the species Australopithecus Afarensis, as represented by Lucy, is a species that we feel is ancestral to modern humans. And the significance of Lucy is that she gives us a good idea of what our ancestors looked like some 3 million years ago. We can learn from her skeleton about the way that she walked, for example. When we look at her knee joint, when we look at her pelvis, we see that she walked like you and I, instead of like a chimpanzee.
Johansson said, even though this is a very ape-like creature, it walked upright. Well, the pygmy chimp today wanders around in the rainforest walking upright almost all the time, so that doesn't prove anything.
Actually, the only features of Lucy which even hint at erect posture are the knee and hip joints. Dr. Charles Oxnard, with a sophisticated computer analysis, has concluded that Johansson's claims for the hip are unfounded, and it must be pointed out that the knee was not even found with Lucy.
This knee joint was found over a mile away, 200 feet deeper than the other bones.
She comes closer to representing, I think, what the average person thinks of as the missing link than any other fossil we had ever found in Africa. So she has extraordinary importance in terms of understanding the very earliest phases of human evolution.
Richard Leakey and others are now claiming that, in all likelihood, Lucy is really a mosaic of 2 or more species. This isn't funny. What is funny is that they claim that creation isn't scientific.
The next thing back was Piltdown Man. Here was a case where a human skull had been doctored up along with a jaw of an orangutan to make the jaw look somewhat human. The teeth were filed. It turned out to be a pure fraud. Piltdown Man was a purposeful fraud, and it fooled the world's greatest evolutionists simply because they so much wanted to believe that there was some evidence for evolution. Neanderthal man was originally found in the Neanderthal Valley of Germany. These creatures almost all look very modern, but several of them, 2 or 3, had a very stooped over, brutish appearance. Now, however, 2 scientists have gone over to the museums in Europe from Johns Hopkins University, got these bones out of the museums and x-rayed the ones that had a very stooped over appearance. And lo and behold, they discovered that the stooped over creatures had rickets or some vitamin D deficiency disease, such as arthritis. They have reclassified the Neanderthals from a separate species, now put them back into Homo sapiens, the same as modern man. Now, Nebraska man consisted of nothing but a single tooth. And around this single tooth, pictures were drawn showing an ape-like creature that had evolved into man. It turned out later that this tooth was nothing but the tooth of an extinct pig. And this is a case now where a pig made a monkey out of an evolutionist. I think man has always been man. The scientific evidence shows this, and this, of course, is very consistent with the account of creation that is presented in the book of Genesis. Behind closed doors, or occasionally when speaking very candidly, the evolutionists admit there is really no evidence that man evolved from the ape.
Okay. Just one more thing I want to point out in there is there's been a lot of controversy about Neanderthals over the years. Like he was mentioning, they're often portrayed as these like brutish creatures, but now more and more people are saying they were modern. They were just like another like subspecies of human. And there's even a widespread belief that most modern humans, especially coming from European ancestry, could have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome, which would infer that early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred and exchanged genetic material, kind of a hybrid. And so, which would tell me they're not different species if they could breed and produce viable offspring. Does that make sense? Okay. As far as Homo erectus goes, and Afarensis, and some of these other ones, I don't know. I don't think Satan put the skulls in the fossil record to try Christians' faith. I just think they're probably an extinct form of life that we don't have today, but once were very wide-ranging in the world. Okay, any other questions or comments on that? I just wanted you to see some like counterpoint between human evolution. It's really important for me that you understand the evolutionist point of view. Once again, I'm not asking you to believe it or agree with it. I just, as part of your education, I want you to at least understand the theory of human evolution. Apparently, some 200,000 years ago, human biology was comparable to modern day humans. Now, there's some debate whether if you took a child from 200,000 years ago from Homo sapiens and put them into modern society, would you be able to tell the difference, or could you just raise them as a modern human? Some human geneticists and evolutionists believe that there were other mutations that had to take place that had to do with our speech and reasoning process. So that perhaps maybe 70,000 years ago, if you took one of those children from early Cro-Magnon or something, you could bring them into modern society and they could adapt perfectly because for all intents and purposes, their brains, their physiology is modern human. Part of what's curious to me, however, even if you use the 70,000 year date, we don't have civilization until roughly 3,500 BCE. And civilization in this context is determined by writing, written language, etc. That is when a society is considered to be civilized and historic. A pre-literate society is considered prehistoric, at least according to anthropology. So you could theoretically have modern prehistoric societies if it's like an illiterate society living today. Anyways, when we look at advances in agriculture, pastoralism, the domestication of like plants and animals, when we look at the earliest written writing we have is 3,500 BCE, and that's in China, Sumeria, Egypt. It's curious to me, how did it take humans so long to figure that out if they had modern minds? Why would it have taken 130,000 years roughly to learn how to read and write? Also, this idea of making the connection between seeds and growing things. I mean, would it really have taken 196,000 years to figure out that if you planted some of the seeds you gathered, you could grow the crops near your home. Or if you didn't kill the bison's calf and have to carry it back, but you led it back to your encampment so you had fresh meat whenever you were ready for it, and leading to domestication. And anyways, we're out of time for today. Next class, which I guess is our last class, so I'm going to do it during our scheduled final time. I'll have to look when that is. But I do think it's important. I want to cover dating techniques a little bit, and then I want to talk some about social Darwinism and some of the ramifications of Darwinian theory. And all right, so thanks for joining me today.